Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the first panel of today's session. I add my welcome to that of the previous speakers, and thank you again for joining us despite the difficulty in being able to reach Soleimani, and so glad to have you with us today. We have a good variety of speakers throughout the day, but the first panel today I feel is very, very rich. We're going to try to allow the speakers to engage us with their thoughts before we open up for questions and answers. And I think the first person we really want to hear from is Iraq's National Security Advisor, His Excellency Qasem Al-A'raji. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to open up with a very broad question. We'll listen to him for a few minutes before we move on to the next speakers. Sayyid Qasem, ahlan wa sahlan, Ma'ali al-Mustashar. My question is, obviously Iraq is now friends with the United States and with Iran. Iran is concerned about US actions inside Iraq. The United States is worried about Iranian actions inside Iraq. Where do you see Iraq being able to balance between these two countries in terms of government policy? يعني العراق والولايات المتحدة وإيران مثلث صعب. ما هي أولويات الحكومة العراقية تجاه العلاقات ما بين هاي الدول؟ تفضلوا.
شكرا جزيلا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سماحة السيد السادة الحضور، قادة العراق، ضيوف العراق، السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. حقيقة العراق يحتفظ بعلاقات جيدة ومتميزة مع الجمهورية الإسلامية. لدينا حدود مشتركة 1449 كيلو. لدينا علاقات ثقافية واجتماعية ودينية وسياسية. لدينا مشتركات متعددة، وبنفس الوقت لدينا علاقات جيدة مع الجانب الأمريكي. العراق يؤمن بسياسة الحوار والدبلوماسية في حل كل خلافاته ومشاكله مع دول الجوار ومع دول المنطقة. العراق غادر سياسة الحروب والقتال، وبالتالي يسعى ليكون فاعلا، والعراق لديه موقع مهم واستراتيجي بأن يكون نقطة التقاء بين الآخرين. وهذه العلاقة الجيدة والمتميزة التي ينفرد بها العراق مهمة للجانب الأمريكي ومهمة للجانب الإيراني. نسعى للتخفيف، نسعى لأن يكون هناك تواصل. سماحة السيد عبدالعزيز الحكيم الله يرحمه في وقت دعا إلى الحوار الأمريكي الإيراني في بغداد، وتم هذا الحوار وخفف كثير من الاحتقان، وبالتالي هذه سياسة مستمرة في العراق. العراق يؤكد على أن يكون الوحدة المجتمعية والتماسك المجتمعي هو الأساس داخليا. الاتفاق السياسي، التوازن، وأيضا أن يكون الجميع شركاء وليس مشاركين. يؤمن بهذه الثلاثية المهمة لتعزيز الوضع في العراق، تعزيز العلاقة بين بغداد والإقليم والعراق الموحد. الكل الحمد لله يعمل على أن يكون العراق مستقل ذو سيادة وأيضا موحد سيادة القانون. نعم، ظروف متعددة مر بها العراق، الوضع الأمني، الوضع السياسي، الوضع الاقتصادي، لكن نشهد مزيد من الاستقرار. وعندما اليوم الكثير من أبناء الوسط والجنوب المنطقة الغربية في الأعياد والمناسبات يأتون إلى إقليم كردستان للسياحة، وهذا دليل على أن هنالك تطور كبير. كثير من المناطق في العراق اليوم هنالك حملة من الإعمار، في بغداد هنالك حملة من الإعمار تساعد. نؤمن أن الإعمار يساعد على الأمن، والأمن يساعد على الاستقرار، وبالتالي مزيد من الاستثمارات. أنا أعتقد العراق دور كبير مستقبلا وفاعل من أجل تسوية الخلافات اللي موجودة، والعراق سعى والكل يعلم بالتقارب السعودي الإيراني وله السبق في ذلك ويسجل العراق، واليوم نشهد مزيد من الأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة.
أتعتقد أنه من الممكن العراق يبقى صديق إلى إيران وصديق إلى الولايات المتحدة في آن واحد؟
نعم، لديه القدرة أن يبقى صديق مع الجميع، وخصوصا مع الجمهورية الإسلامية والجانب الأمريكي، ونوظف هذه العلاقة من أجل التخفيف ومن أجل الهدوء والاستقرار.
أحسنتم، شكرا جزيلا معالي المستشار. Now I will turn to Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Sagar, who is the chairman of the Gulf Research Center. Unfortunately, he was not able to join us here in person today because of the weather in Dubai. He will be joining us online. I hope to be able to make sure that he can hear all our questions. Dr. Abdulaziz, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Sagar. I want to open up with a quick question to yourself with regards to Iraq's relations with the GCC countries. Where do you see the most important need for improvement in relations? Is it with regards to security or with energy? If there was one thing that you would make a priority for both sides in terms of relations, what would it be? Please, Dr. Abdulaziz.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. فخامة الرئيس دكتور برهم صالح، سماحة السيد عمار الحكيم، أصحاب المعالي دولة رئيس وزراء إقليم كردستان، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. كم كنت أتمنى أن أكون بين أهلي وإخواني في السليمانية، فهذه مدينة أحبها وأحب أهلها وأحب العراق وأحب أهله، ولكن مع الأسف الشديد ظروف الجو بالأمس في دبي منعتني من التواجد بينكم، بين أهلي وإخواني وأحبتي. سؤالك مهم جدا، لكن سمحت لي يمكن بس أبغى أمر على ما هي النقاط الأساسية في دول الخليج التي تجعل هنالك نوع من الحساسية على بعض النقاط. وبالتأكيد ما تناوله فخامة الرئيس برهم في كلمته وسماحة السيد حفظه الله كلمة ضافية ومهمة ومفيدة جدا، وركزوا على كل النقاط. وأيضا في نقاش سماحة السيد هو تطرق لكثير من القضايا التي تعنى بها منطقة الخليج، ويعني تسبب لها بعض الحساسية. على سبيل المثال، أنت سألت ما هي النقطة الأساسية الأولى. الخليج يريد عراقا مستقلا بقراره لا تابعا لجهة أخرى، بمعنى نتفهم مصالح الدول الأخرى سواء الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أو إيران أو تركيا أو أي أطراف أخرى إقليمية تحاول التدخل في الشأن العراقي، ولكن نريد عراقا مستقلا ينعم أهله وشعبه بالرخاء والرفاهية مستقلين في قرارهم، لأن كل ما كان هنالك استقلالية في قرار العراق، كلما كان هنالك سيطرة للحكومة المركزية، كلما كان هنالك تفضيل المصلحة الوطنية العراقية على أي مصلحة أخرى. هذا ما نريده، لأنه نستطيع أن نتعايش بسلم وأمان في المنطقة. نحن نريد عراقا آمنا مزدهرا مستقلا في قراره موحدا في العراق. تميز عن بقية الدول العربية بأن دستوره ضمن الحريات للأقليات ومشاركتها ووجودها. فعلى كل يعني هذا يمكن النقطة الأولى الأساسية المهمة. ولكن معالي المستشار تطرق على الدور العراقي المهم بالنسبة للاجتماعات التي تمت بين المملكة العربية السعودية والجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية في العراق، وهذا دور مهم جدا نتج عنه اتفاق بكين في 10 مارس 2023. النقطة المهمة هنا في هذه أن إيران أصرت أن تكون هذه الاتفاقية هي عودة علاقة ثنائية. هي مرت بثلاث مراحل أساسية. المرحلة الأولى كانت خفض التصعيد، والمرحلة الثانية كانت إعادة العلاقات الدبلوماسية المشتركة بين الجانبين، والمرحلة الثالثة التي نتطلع لها مستقبلا هو التعاون الاقتصادي والتجاري فيما بين. لكن مرحلة التعاون يشوبها قضيتين: استمرار السياسة الإيرانية في المنطقة والتي لا نتوافق معها مطلقا. نريد أن تحسن إيران من علاقتها في المنطقة دون أن يكون هنالك سياسة التدخل في الشأن الداخلي العربي. نحترم الجوار الإيراني، نقدره، إيران دولة لها مكانتها وتقديرها وشعبها له كل الاحترام والتقدير، لكن حينما يكون هنالك سياسة توسعية تدخلية، الأمن البحري في إشكالية، الأمن الإقليمي هنالك إشكالية، هذه تصبح مزعجة للعراق ولنا. لما تدعم إيران أحزاب سياسية في العراق دائما تؤكد على قضية الاستعداء أو يعني إطلاق تصريحات عدائية على دول منطقة الخليج. هذا ليس محبب. حينما يكون هنالك تهديدات من بعض الجماعات السياسية أو الميليشيات السياسية المسلحة في العراق تقوم بهذا النوع من التهديد، بالتأكيد هذا يحجب الرغبة الحقيقية الخليجية في التوسع الاستثماري في العراق وتطور هذه العلاقة إلى الدرجة والمستوى التي نرغب أن تكون عليها بشكل أكبر وأوسع. هنالك يعني ما يجمع الكثير بين شعوب المنطقة الخليجية والعراق. نريد عراقا آمنا مستقرا يعود إلى حضنه الإقليمي، يساهم بدوره الفعال. العراق لديه إمكانيات من شعبه العظيم، من خبراتهم، من إمكانياتهم، من دوره، من موقعه الإقليمي، من كل إمكانياته اللي يمكن أن تكون حتى يعيش هذا الشعب في أفضل وأروع يعني وضع ممكن يكون.
شكرا دكتور عبدالعزيز على وقتك. و again, we are sorry that you could not join us in person, but thank you for the comments, and I'm sure there's a lot to follow on from there in the questions and answers afterwards. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Khalil, who's the Vice President Research at the Institute for Political International Studies. Dr. Khalil, thank you for joining us. Obviously, Iran has been in the headlines in the last 2 weeks, if not the last 2 decades. But with regards to relations with Iraq, what is Iran's priority? What does it want from Iraq? Does it want for Iraq to be friends with all the countries in the region? Does it want Iraq to be a very stern and committed ally towards Iran? What about Iraq's relations with the United States? What would you see as Iran's priority towards Iraq's foreign relations? Please, Dr. Khalil. Please go ahead. Yeah, it should be on. Should. Sorry, just
okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Honorable officials, excellencies, first of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be in this very prestigious event. I would like to express my heartfelt appreciation for the American University of Suleimania and Your Excellency President Barhem Saleh for giving me this chance to talk to you. You know, when we were talking about Iran's policies, there are many disinformation, misinformation, as well as misunderstanding. And many things are misunderstood. And it's, let's say, it's a campaign by conscience. It's not something by accident. The fact that there are some elements to make this very dark picture of Iran based on some allegations which are not true at all. And among them is the fact that there is a very traditional, historical, and cultural connectivity between Iran and Iraq as 2 brother nations, 2 friendly nations, having many things in common, having many commonalities, having, let's say, many interests in common. And the fact that this connectedness between our nations makes a very natural, legitimate, let's say, connectivity and also influence, a very legitimate influence of Iran in Iraq, as well as a very legitimate influence by Iraqis in Iran as well. This is a fact that you cannot ignore based on the historical facts. And it's good that we have proven for several times that we perceive the security of Iraq and the prosperity of the Iraqi nations as the security and prosperity of the Iranian nation. And you know the history behind, and you know that regardless of the fact that there has been, let's say, 8-year wars between the 2 countries based on the wills of a dictator, which was an evil for the Iraqi nations as well as for the whole region. Nowadays, we highly value the excellent relationship between Iraq and Iran, which is at the best of the both nations. This is a fact on the ground. Unfortunately, regardless of all disinformations and misinformation I just mentioned, the fact is that we are experiencing a very positive perceptual change in the mindset of the leaders of the region. Be in Iran, be in Saudi Arabia, be in Iraq, everywhere. The fact that everybody is exhausted from conflicts and they are gonna prioritizing the economic development and the prosperity of the regional nations. And this perceptual change, which I can name it as an intellectual renaissance in the region, could contribute very positively to integration of the region, all countries in the Persian Gulf, and be as a very important element for having some sort of homegrown indigenous architecture, not only for the security of the region, but also for the economic prosperity of all nations here in this region. So this is very positive, point. And unfortunately, while we have this very positive atmosphere and the fact that Iran-Saudi rapprochement was based on this new perceptual change in the mindset of the leaders in every side, the fact that unfortunately the very root causes of the problem in this region is still persistent. And that's the Palestinian cause and this 75 years of history of occupation, which is an ongoing history, not finished yet. The fact that the Palestinian people are deprived from their very inherent rights to have their own country, to have their own land, against an occupier, which is an artificial transplant in this region, which is Israel. So the root causes of every problem is the Israeli regime in the region, and what has happened in last 7 months and the recent developments, which gonna be escalate everything in this region and to bring, unfortunately, that a possible all-out and full-scale war in this region. So I think as Iran and Arab countries in the region, we have many things in common. We highly value this relationship, and we are working to consolidate this cooperation and consolidate the amity between Iran and Arab countries. And in that regard, Iraq is also a very important priority for Iran based on the fact that we have proven that we are among the best friends of Iraq, and we remain the same policy in future as well.
Thank you, Dr. Shighalami. I share your sense of optimism. I think there is a change in the region with regards to mindsets of certain leaders in certain countries. But I do hope that recent events don't overshadow the potential for more security and stability in the future.
The point is that Iran is not going for and is not aiming for any escalation in the region. And the fact that, as it was well elaborated by His Excellency Mr. Hakim, the fact that Iran adopted a very patient policy towards the reckless attacks by Israel in last 1-2 years against Iran in Syria, and the fact that we just decided to show that we have the determination for self-defense. And the fact that Iran did not decide for any escalation based on the fact that we did not decide and we did not aim for any surprise attack to Israel. From 2-3 days before, this punishment action by Iran against Israel, many countries in the region well aware about it. We informed them about it. And it was not our aim to have this surprise attack, but it was something important for Iran to show that we have the determination and will to defend ourselves. And that we did not aim also any casualties in occupied lands. And the fact that what was important for Iran was to show that Israel is not going to escape the punishment, while unfortunately based on the policies of the Western countries, which is also another root cause of the problem. You cannot attack others and to be able to escape the punishment forever. This is what happened, and still we decided that Iran is not going for escalation. We perceive it as something ended unless the Israelis will do something against Iran. This is very important, and I want to reiterate and emphasize the fact that while there has been many talks about what was the effect of this, action by Iran and how efficient it was, the fact that Iran only used maybe 5% of its capabilities, while Israel, with the help of at least 5-6 countries, they utilize their 100% of capability to defend against these attacks, which was not necessarily the best technology of what we have in Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Shighalami. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Marie Fantapié, who's head of the MENA program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Buongiorno, Maria. Thank you for joining us. I want to ask a two-folded question. The first is, from a European perspective, what worries you the most about Iraq's current situation with regards to its foreign relations, with regards to the region, but also what is your hope, what is your optimism? What do you think is the potential in terms of, at least on the optimistic side, for Iraq going forward in the region? Please, Maria.
Thank you, Sajjad, and thank you for the Soleimani Forum, particularly despite the recent events. And I think to answer your question, I will say that despite my colleague here has given a quite reassuring description of what has just happened, I think we are, if I have to take a snapshot of the region at this moment, we are quite on a difficult spot because the three main root conflicts of the Middle East are now active. When I speak about root conflicts, are conflicts that might have been dormant over like the years, but they have generated other conflicts. And the first one is the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been also dormant for some time, and now obviously it's in full-fledged, again, active. The second one is the Israel-Iran competition. And the third one is nuclear and arms proliferations across the region. So these three are all in full-fledged active. So what's worrying us and me and any citizen of the world, but I think that mostly also citizens of the region, is the fact that these three are active. The fact that they are active, I think it also tells us something about the fact that the attempts that they have been made to integrate and stabilize the regions have been good, but maybe they have left unaddressed some of the key issues. The first one was obviously the process of normalization with Israel. The second one is the process of Iran re-engagement with the Arab world. I think that what these two processes, which have been positive, but they have left unaddressed, is first Iran ambitions. Iran didn't want to actually be second ranked below other Gulf powers like Saudi Arabia. Second, they have also left unaddressed nuclear proliferation, and the failure of the JCPOA is obviously a hint at this. But also they have left unaddressed the Israel-Palestine conflict. So we are at this moment where I think that these processes that have taken places, they have sort of raised the hope for integration and stability, but also left unaddressed some of this root conflicts, which are now on the surface. Now, coming to your question on what worries European policymakers on Iraq, I think, I will say that what worries everyone is what is in the middle between Israel and Iran. So basically the entire Levant, of which Iraq is part. I think that the dangers that we are seeing is that Iran and Israel will become the only game in town, and each one will try to just drag all the other countries on their side. So Israel will use the fear of Iran-influenced expansions in the region and in the Arab world, and Iran will use the fear of the betrayal of the Palestinian cause. I'm sorry, I'm very direct because I'm an independent analyst, so I have to say things the way they are. So I think that there are these two elements which are very worrying, and I think Iraq will be really in a difficult spot in escaping from this. First of all, I think that what is the danger for Iraq is that it will turn into a territory rather than a state. Said al-Hakim before told us about the state and the importance of the state institution. My fear is that this place will turn more and more as a launch pin of confrontations and also a receivers of attacks. And the Kurds know very well what I'm talking about. It also is very difficult because Iraq will be less and less able to manage the Iran-US competitions. And I think that there will be more pressure on the Iraqi government from Iran to take a side, but also the US will be a less reliable and rational actor. We have seen US taking retaliatory actions. So on that, I think we also can see that the US will be could be less rational in some way and more giving the priority, let's say, to Israel security and the security of its own personnel. And last but not least, I think that another source of worry is obviously the domestic factor, the internal fragmentation of politics here, which has just sort of led to a fragmentation of established political parties. And I know all the people in the first row, they know what I'm talking about. Personality politics, which enables foreign influence. So my just two quick takeaway will be that I would make maybe a short appeal to the people in the first row to say that this is really a moment where it's very dangerous to play into the narratives of either Israel or Iran, and it's very important to prioritize rationality and pragmatism. And one of the main policy line that I think Iraq state women and men should follow, it's really that one of diversifying the regional policy, continuing on that line and doubling down on that line, because it will not be the US who saves Iraq at this point, but it will be really the diversification of the of relations with the neighbors, and in particular with the Gulf country. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. If I could just follow very quickly, where is your optimism on this? I mean, if you were to be optimistic, what do you think are the opportunities for Iraq?
Well, being optimistic, it's, I'm not sure I am optimistic at all. I'm not optimistic about Europe. I'm not optimistic. I'm very concerned about Europe, the decline of Europe as a strategic player. So I'm not, I think, in the position of say there is something optimistic. I think that we live in interesting times, like some said, that in the sense that things are changing. We are moving forward a different era where Western unipolarism is no longer there. And so all of us, Europeans in the Middle East, we have to adapt to this new reality. My optimism is that us as citizens and leaders will be having the sort of vision to handle this moment of historical transformation, rather than dragging all of us in further conflict.
Thank you, Maria. And last but not least, I want to welcome Dr. Badr al-Saif, who is the Assistant Professor of History at the Kuwaiti University. Hayya Ustad Badr. I want to put a very quick question, which you can sort of expand on. In my view, I think Iraq's relations with Kuwait have been probably the most positive of all the countries since 2003. But I feel every now and then there is a spike in tensions. I mean, the issues around the ports and waterway access and so on. I'd like to ask you, where do you think relations between the two countries will go from here, specifically Iraq-Kuwait relations, but also further out, Iraq relations with the rest of the Gulf countries? Where do you think we're likely to be headed in the next 2 to 3 years? Please, Ustad Badr, hayakallah.
Thank you, Sajjad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أصحاب الفخامة والمعالي والسيادة الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سعيد لتواجدي في بلدي الثاني وشكرا على الدعوة الكريمة. اسمحوا لي أن ننتقل إلى اللغة الإنجليزية. In relation to looking at how Kuwait and Iraq operate with one another, I would like to argue that there are more commonalities between the two countries than the policymakers themselves realize. And if I may break down my contribution to 3 parts, I'll begin with the past, move to the present, and I think where we should go in the future. And where I think we missed, there was a missed opportunity in the past. Both countries have gone through a lot of traumas. Some traumas are internal to their own circumstances, and some traumas were born because of the circumstances between the two countries. There hasn't been a proper national healing or reconciliation, both within the two countries concerned and between the two countries. And that's why you see some manifestations popping up every now and then, reflecting on those unmet challenges. Now, moving to the present, we cannot fully blame both countries' relationships towards one another for stalling some of the files. It's a mixed bag. First, you have domestic concerns in both countries that have led to not moving as much as both countries would like them to move. There has been the building of the state in Iraq. There has been some, challenges in the security front. From the Kuwait side, there has been a lot of instability. For example, in the last 4 years, we've had 4 prime ministers. We're moving on the 11th government, 4 parliaments. So it takes away from focusing with a deep intent on bilateral relations. But if I may also somewhat criticize both sides, policymakers, because there needs to be more work on assuaging the the battle of narratives is what I call it, the anti-Kuwait narrative in Iraq and the anti-Iraq narrative in Kuwait. There are certain circles that still are remnants of the past and they're not pushing forward. Now, if we look at the cup half full, there has been certain milestones. I mean, Iraq committed to paying the compensations from the invasion, even though the regime has changed. This was completed 2 years ago. Iraq is working very hard on uncovering the remnants of the bodies that are lost during the occupation. Kuwait has worked with Iraq to push it out of Chapter 7 in the UN. Kuwait has helped work on upgrading the borders. And we've also, ironically, one of the reasons that supposedly led to the invasion, we're working together on joint oil field productions. So there is a lot of early steps, yes, but we're working towards them. What can we do moving forward? And that's the future bucket. I think we need to move away from laser focus lenses on certain issues. For example, the latest issue has been the Khor Abdullah navigation agreement. I think we need to broaden the negotiation framework. We need to have some room for trade-offs. And I think we can add other files along with the navigation file. There is room for building cooperation between the two ports, FAO and Mubarak. How about cross-trade in terms of building free trade zones? The issue of educational exchanges. We have untapped potential in what I call the soft power between the two countries, popular diplomacy. There is a lot of kinship, shared culture, and religious affinities as well that we need to tap into. I think both countries need to have a strategic vision and plan that pushes them forward and to continue their communication. Now, in terms of your second question concerning the relationship with the region, Kuwait sees itself as part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the GCC states want to see a healthy, resilient Iraq, just as our friend Dr. Abdulعزيز has mentioned, and that cannot be underestimated. Any success that happens between any of the GCC member states is a success to Kuwait and to Iraq. And I think that's the vision that we want to move forward with. We need to ease visa restrictions. We need to take stock and note of what happened when the Basra Soccer Cup happened. And there was so much emotional giveaways between both sides in a very positive way. We need to capitalize on that.
Thank you, Dr. I think that's a very positive note to end on before we open up to questions and answers. The first question I have is to the National Security Advisor, Said Al-Araji. If there is a change in the White House after the elections in November, do you fear that Iraq will be forced to choose between the United States and Iran?
شكرا جزيلا. أنا بالبداية أحيي أخي العزيز من دولة الكويت الشقيقة وأثني على كلامه، ونؤكد أن الكويت دولة جارة شقيقة ذات سيادة، والعراق يحترم الكويت بشكل كبير، وأطالب السيدة أن يكون لديها صبر استراتيجي وتفاعل استراتيجي، ويجب أن تكون متفاعلة بشكل كبير. والعراق غير متخوف بتحول في الإدارة الأمريكية. أمريكا بلد مؤسسات، وبالتالي العراق بهيئ نفسه أن يتعامل مع كل الظروف من أجل مصلحة عراقية تؤدي إلى تنمية وتطور. لدينا اتفاقية طرف استراتيجي أشار لها سماحة السيد، وهذه الاتفاقية في كافة المجالات. ممكن الفترة السابقة تم التركيز على الجانب الأمني، ولكن هي شاملة لكل المجالات، والعراق يحرص جدا على تفعيل كل هذه البنود الاتفاقية، وبالتالي تؤسس إلى علاقة وشراكة حقيقية لا تتأثر بتغيير الحكومات في البيت الأبيض.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Shilghalami. The question says, if the United States decides to maintain its presence in Iraq going forward, maybe even increase the size of its presence in Iraq, what is Iran's options? What are their response going to be? Is it possible that Iran is considering accepting US presence in Iraq or throughout the region? What is likely to happen as a response?
While we perceive the American entanglement in the region as a source of unrest and instability in the region for many years. It's up to the Iraqi nation to decide what to do with that, based on the fact that Iraq is, as an independent country, considering its own legitimate interests, security, economic, political interests. It's up to them to decide about it, as they have decided in the parliament, in the Iraqi parliament, about that. So, first of all, I would like to reiterate the fact that Iraq should not be the battleground for any country, for any rivals. We have proven the fact that we perceive Iraq as very important neighbor, independent country, and they can decide, and they do decide for what it's at their best interest. This is the fact on the ground. But when you're talking about some very natural dynamics in the region, you cannot ignore the realities, the grassroots realities in the region. The fact that when you're talking about, the very root causes of the problem here in this region, which is the Zionist regime, the fact that we have two kind of narratives. The first narrative is the so-called peace narrative, which did not work for many years, and you Europeans know better than me why it did not work, this so-called peace narrative in the region. Because of the fact that Israelis, it's in the political philosophy of Zionism that they do not accept anything less than a total Jews country in the whole treaties, and even in their dreams, it's the expansionist philosophy of having bigger size of the, lands here in this region. This is a very, very principal fact. And you know that Netanyahu declared that it's my best pride that I did not let the Palestinian state to be a real. So this narrative, this so-called peace narrative, did not work. And the nations in the region, they did not have any other chance, and also Palestinians, to adopt the next narrative, which is the resistant narrative. The so-called resistant access in this region is not something artificially made by Iran, as it is perceived by some Western countries or by propaganda. It's the very natural dynamic of the region. Because of the fact that the nations in this region understood that this Zionist regime and this expansionist philosophy of Zionism will be a danger for all of them. And the Palestinians and the nations in the region decide to adopt this resistant narrative based on the cause of the Palestine, which is a very critical, important, fundamental cause for the whole Muslims. This is very important.
Thank you, Dr. Khalil. Before I go to the next question, if you do have a question, please scan the QR code on the back of your badge. You'll be able to see in the portal a way to submit your questions. I'll receive your questions there. If we have enough time, I'll try to get to all the questions. For Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Sagr, the question from Areen Dara says, after the Gaza conflict is over, whenever that is, how will the security dynamic in the MENA region change? What is going to happen after the end of this conflict? Dr. Abdulaziz.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's very clear today that the international forces are the one who's playing a significant role in the security of the region, i.e., as an example, the latest Iranian attack on Israel was responded not only by the Israeli military capability, but also it did include the American, the British, the French, and even some of the other countries there. So, and the Red Sea security also issue, we have seen the international contribution and the international presence there also playing a significant role on the Red Sea security and the maritime security issue. So what will happen after Gaza, I think if the Israeli want to live in peace, they have to recognize the Arab country wishes, which is immediately stop of the not only a ceasefire, but a permanent ceasefire, allowing all the humanitarian support to go through, and at the same time accepting a political solution, which is the two-state solution. Prior to that, releasing the hostages from both sides. If that's the Israeli, they're going to accept this condition, then we will have a much better environment to have a peaceful security in the region. But without having a collective regional coordination to negotiate with the US, because the US remain the only country that can exert the pressure in Israel to accept the two-state solution and to accept the immediate ceasefire to be implemented. So that's the key issue to get it successful in the region.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question to that. Do you think Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords?
I think Saudi Arabia have made it very clear in their negotiation with the US prior to 7th of October. There were three issues. The peaceful nuclear program for Saudi Arabia, which means Saudi, as member of the NPT, should not sign the 123 agreement, which was demanded by the US. Second is the defense agreement arrangement between Saudi Arabia and the US, which will provide a necessary protection. And third is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to be resolved by a two-state solution and a permanent and a viable work, peace agreement to be reached. If that will be met, definitely Saudi Arabia are not going to close the door for normalization. They started it in 1982, the first talk about the having a peace in the region and normalization with Israel. But it's the Israel who have been continuously resisting any sort of two-state solution and resisting any peaceful treaty to be reached. However, I think I'm quite optimistic in a way by saying that the 1991, Kuwait-Iraq conflict have resulted to Oslo, Madrid and then Oslo. Prior to that, the 73 have resulted to Camp David and Haraba. So what is going to be resulted out of Gaza conflict? Hopefully there will be a peace in the region, because we all need to have that. We have left a lot of wars in the region, and it is time for the people in the region to enjoy peace, security, and safety and prosperity.
Thank you. Maria, there's a question here that says, do you think Iraq can play a role in trying to progress regional diplomatic stability? Is it going to host Iran-US negotiations in the future? Can Iraq play a role in trying to sort of reduce the tensions in the region?
Thank you, Sajjad. We have seen Iraq being a facilitator in the past, especially of Iran-Saudi dialogue. I think that somehow Iraq, the government at least, has almost no choice. Either it does that, or if it doesn't do that, it falls victim of it. So it's a bit of this the situation that I am seeing. I think that there is a lot of potential to achieve what Dr. Abdulaziz was mentioning. So a better regional stability. Really by, as I said before, investing more in this Iraq-Gulf relations and like Iraq integration with the Gulf. I think that it's a good line of work, which does not only reinforce Iraq's sovereignty, but also, I think, contribute to the general stability. And I think that I support the idea that there is a way forward to actually undermine the battle for narratives and this competition that is happening. And as it was mentioned, it's also that some of the GCC countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, will take a lead, in my view, in proposing a solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But this obviously also needs the US backup and also perhaps a different Israeli counterpart to make this moving forward. But again, like Iraq, Gulf integration is a good line of work. In terms of other line of work, I think it's very difficult to think Iraq as a mediator between the United States and Iran. I think on the contrary, there will be pressing demands from both sides, even on military terms, even if I'm not a military expert. On the one side, to actually cooperate militarily against Iranian attack, and on the other side, to let pass military attacks that are projected to Israel or other targets. So that will be a very difficult spot that Iraq will be in. So rather not a mediator, but I think it may be back channel facilitator for this type of conflict not to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I have a question again for the National Security Advisor, Mr. Laraji. The question says, Iraq's recently increased its security cooperation with Turkey, and we expect a visit from President Erdogan to Iraq soon. Do you have fears of the potential of tensions and conflict with Turkey inside Iraq?
لدينا لجنة عليا مشكلة بأمر السيد رئيس الوزراء، اللجنة برئاسة السيد وزير الخارجية والسيد وزير الدفاع وحضوري أنا شخصيا والسيد وزير داخلية الإقليم وكذلك السيد رئيس هيئة الحج الشعبي الأستاذ فالح الفياض، وعقدنا اجتماع في أنقرة وعقدنا اجتماع في بغداد، وبالتالي هنالك زيارة مرتقبة وكبيرة للسيد الرئيس التركي إلى بغداد، ولدينا عدد من مذكرات التفاهم التي سوف يتم التوقيع عليها، ومنها مذكرة تفاهم إطار العلاقة والتنسيق بين البلدين، وفيها لجان 5: اللجنة الأمنية ولجنة المياه ولجنة النقل ولجنة الطاقة ولجنة الاقتصاد ورجال الأعمال. والعراق حريص على حل هذه المشاكل والإشكالات إن كانت موجودة، ووجدنا رغبة حقيقية وجادة من الجانب التركي، وبالتالي العراق يسعى بعد أن وقعنا اتفاق الأمني مع الجمهورية الإسلامية في 19 آذار سنة 23 وبرعاية السيد رئيس الوزراء، وتم تشكيل لجنة عليا، وعقدت هذه اللجنة 14 اجتماع في بغداد وطهران وأبريل والسليمانية، وتوصلنا إلى حلول إيجابية جدا محل رضا وقبول الجانب الإيراني وكذلك الأوساط السياسية في داخل العراق. يسعى العراق بكل جهد من أجل حل وتصفير الأزمات، وأنا متفائل بنجاح هذه الزيارة وبالتوقيع المذكرات القادمة بإذن الله تعالى.
شكرا جزيلا. Dr. Badr al-Saif, question says, we have an increase in the amount of disinformation, campaigns to sway public opinion, cyber attacks, that's particularly prevalent in the Middle East. What would you advise countries like Iraq in terms of policy to try to combat these waves of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation? What would you think is the best approach for a government like Iraq in terms of trying to combat this?
I think what goes for Iraq goes for other countries, and you need a multi-layered approach. So having more than one strategy. First, you need to be up to speed on the latest technology, obviously, but I think you need society's contribution to attack and go after this misinformation by sharing your own narrative. And that takes time. I mean, it gets belittled, but then to share a narrative, you really need to know what is your narrative. So you need to go through that exercise to begin with. And there will never be one common, solidly tied narrative. There will always be variation. But let's have a range in which we can accept one another within that narrative. If I take those battle of narratives between Iraq and Kuwait, what's misfortunate in both countries is that those narratives are not used for the sake of the country that's being exposed. It's for the sake for domestic consumption. So you see them prop up in election seasons, you see them come up to score battle points against other local actors within the country. And we need to educate the populace and ourselves about the risks of going about that, because it could be that you are pushing this as a tactic, but then it becomes a truth at the end of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Badr. I have a question for Dr. Abdulaziz. Where do you think, in terms of after, let's say, the end of this conflict in Gaza, but also looking further ahead, where do you think Iraq's position will be with regards to the Palestinian issue? Do you think Iraq is going to be a stronger supporter of the Palestinian cause, or wanting to withdraw a little bit in terms of not wanting to become entangled in conflict? Where do you see Iraq heading with regards to the conflict in Palestine?
العراق دائما تمتع بموقف مشرف ومتميز بالنسبة للقضية الفلسطينية، ولم يساوم على هذا أبدا. المهم هو كيف يستطيع العراق الحفاظ على استقلالية قراره، توازنه في العلاقة مع كافة الأطراف. على سبيل المثال، مصلحة إيران في عدم وجود الأمريكي في العراق، ولكن المصلحة العراقية والمصلحة الخليجية بحكم ما لهم من علاقات متميزة مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وبحكم وجود أيضا السيد رئيس الوزراء حاليا في واشنطن للمفاوضة حول قضايا كثير مهمة، هو وجود أمريكي يضمن نوعا من الأمن وأيضا استقلالية القرار العراقي. فالعراق سوف يكون له دور مهم، كان وما زال وسوف يظل هو جزء من هذا المكون العربي الكبير وجزء من القوة الإقليمية المهمة، ولكنه فقد قدرته العسكرية في المشاركة العسكرية مثل ما كان في السابق. هو لديه قدرة اقتصادية ولديه موقع متميز ولديه علاقة مهمة جدا، والأهم من ذلك لديه القدرات البشرية التي يمكن أن تساهم وأن تساعد بشكل كبير جدا. فلذلك أنا لا أعتقد أن هنالك نهاية للدور العراقي، أنا أعتقد أن هنالك إعادة تشكيل للدور العراقي حسب مواقفه السياسية التي سوف يأخذها، ولذلك مهم جدا أن يكون استقلالية القرار التي أكدت عليها من النقطة الأولى بالنسبة للعراق هي قضية مهمة وتستطيع أن تمكن في المستقبل.
شكرا أستاذ. So, but if I could ask you to follow up on that, as a professor of history, where would you stand on this?
Yes, Palestine can never be a second order of things for the region. And if there is a point of convergence between the countries and the people of the region, it's on the centrality of Palestine. And the continuous dehumanization, systematic dehumanization, dispossession, and displacement of Palestinians cannot continue. And I think us pushing forward for a solution, and I agree with you, in which the Gulf can play a central role in getting a Palestinian state that has viability and dignity, that's the only way to cut down on all the narratives that are pushing for creating conflict in the region. Now, this requires a willing partner, and that partner is not willing at this moment, and I'm talking about Israel. So that needs to be the concern of the international community, and that needs to be where the pressure is applied to move towards a just resolution of the issue.
Thank you, Dr. Bella. I'm going to give Dr. Khali one quick opportunity to follow up on this question, and then we'll wrap up with Maria afterwards. Dr. Khali, please, if you could follow up on the issue with regards to what we expect the future of the Palestinian cause in the region.
The point is that we can divide the history before the October 7th and after the October 7th. The fact that the Palestinian cause has given a rebirth in the region among the whole Muslim, based on the fact that it has been somehow forgotten for many years, based on the fact that there has been this hope of the narrative I just mentioned, which is the so-called peace narrative, which did not work because of the fact that when somebody did not perceive somebody as a human being, how come they can get into a settlement with them? Because of the fact that it's a systematic dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And, you know, it's a genocide going on in the occupied lands. So based on that, it seems that there is this new conscience among the whole Muslims everywhere that they need to again prioritize the Palestinian cause based on the realities. And the realities is that we are in the urgent need of having, let's say, Palestine as an independent sovereign state, based on the fact that this occupation will not work anymore and is not gonna work forever. And Iran also introduced a very important initiative, very democratic initiative based on the realities, the fact that we perceive this as maybe the only viable solution for future of Palestine, based on the will of the real Palestinian people, be Jews, be Christians, or be Muslims, to decide about their future. This is the only viable solution, based on the fact that, as much as I can perceive, the Zionist regime will not let the independent Palestinian state to be real, even in future, with all pressures from every side. This is the fact on the ground.
Thank you, Dr. Khali. Maria, we'll end with you. It's a question that says, leaders across the Middle East are facing a lot of pressure internally from the public, not just with regards to recent events, but there is a lot of pressure on political leaders across the Middle East. Where do you think this is heading? Will we see an Arab Spring 2? Do you think instead there will be actually more stability in the future? where do you see sort of across the Middle East, the local dynamics headed, please?
I think that it's important to say that to answer this question, because we spoke for an hour about geopolitics, but there are also individuals and citizens. And I think that we have seen over the years that individuals in Iraq in specific, they have conducted a personal resistance in some way. And the Tishrini movement was a proof of that. I might use the word resistance in a different way than my colleague does, but also that was a form of resistance. So I think that safeguarding these spaces for civic space in some way, for civic activism, which are increasingly shrinking as the geopolitics push forwards narratives and ideology, it's something to think about, definitely. And I will also maybe add one last thing, that it is true that there are commonalities between Iraq and Iran that are linked by culture and religion. But also it's important to, I think, acknowledge that many countries in this region have their own project of integration. Israel has its own project, Iran has its own project. So it's, I think, about time to understand how to de-ideologize these processes that each one wants to achieve, also recognize the limits of it. I'm not sure how much the Islamic Republic in some way thinking can actually take ground across Iraq citizens, young generations, for instance. We have seen pushback against that. And I think that in that, Iran should also assess what is the best way forward. Maybe the Palestinian cause can re-energize support for also what is the cause of the Islamic Republic, but in some way you have to also acknowledge that there are some limitations for that, and make peace with that and see what is the most practical way forward for more regional stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm sure the conversation will continue. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this panel. I'd like to ask you to remain seated for the next panel, which is immediately after this. But before that, please welcome our speakers for their comments and join me in thanking them for their insights today. Thank you very much.